Pádraig Pearse, the man behind the image.
May 1916. Pádraig Pearse is taken at dawn from his cell in Kilmainham jail. He had been the public face of a rising which had proclaimed an Irish Republic and left a city in ruins.
I can think of nobody that was so unselfish about his life. He was ordinary enough to be a relevant person, but extraordinary enough to be heroic.
He inspired generations, but left a terrible legacy of violence.
He's a cynical man, a vain man, a dishonest man, an anti-democrat. He's a proto-fascist.
Pearse showed himself in profile. It hid a slight squint, but also kept his distance from us.
One could see the earnestness, the utter earnestness, the almost mystical earnestness of the man, the feeling that he was living in another world altogether.
Pearse played many parts in his life. Headmaster, author, revolutionary. But who was the real Pádraig Pearse?
Well, Pearse's background was a bit unusual in the Ireland of the time, in that his father was English, and his mother was the second wife of the father, so there was a great age gap between father and mother. Pearse grew up in a lower middle class, I suppose, or upper artisan home, reasonably comfortable. The father came from a Victorian radical artisan background, quite concerned with the search for respectability, as that background tended to be. He began as a stone carver, then described himself as a sculptor, quite successful one.
Well, Pearse's family were going up in the world as he grew up. He was born over the shop, and then they moved to Sandymount, and they acquired a domestic servant, and gradually they became more and more genteel. And I won't say he had a chip on his shoulder, but there was very much a sense of wanting to have made it into the middle classes from, as it were, the upper working.
At Pearse's last home in Rathfarnham, family mementos are stored away. Pearse's father taught him to question authority, but gave him little inspiration to be an Irish patriot.
Pearse's nationalism was not, in any case, inherited from his father. Pearse, when he was a boy, was brought up to speak, and did speak in class once, of the British Navy as our Navy. And the Christian brother in charge of the class came down on him and gave him a terrible tongue punishing, which seems to have stuck with him all his life, that this was the terribly wrong thing to say, so that he kind of repudiates his father and went with his mother's people.
He was getting a very pious nationalist upbringing from his mother and from the Christian brothers, while his father was a radical and a free thinker. The Pearses lived very much in their own little world. There wasn't that much political debate in his house. It was all much more tales of the Irish, Celts, old Gaelic folk tales, that kind of thing.
It was soon apparent that Pearse was an unusual child. In the evenings, he would give lectures to his family on the Celtic and religious fables which seemed to transfix him.
The other children came to and accept him as their leader. and he impressed his personality on them. They became emotionally dependent on him in large measure. That's understandable enough because he was an intriguing personality and he was a strong personality from a very early age.
Even as a child, I mean, his imaginings were absolutely full of self-sacrifice. So it's really the same thing. I mean, lots of children have fantasies about, I don't know, rescuing the maiden from the dragon or being the hero in all sorts of tales, but not many of them see themselves being stretched on a rack to give themselves for their country through torture. He did have a very morbid imagination, no question about that. So that was always there.
Push it up with Pádraig, good lad. Okay, let's take it up, come on. Okay, let's go.
The fall of Parnell had left Pearse's generation disillusioned with politics. He was influenced more by the Gaelic cultural revolution, which swept the country in his adolescence.
2,000 years have rolled away since those mighty heroes trod this land of ours. Yet is their spirit not dead. It lives on in our poetry, in our music, in our language, and in our conviction that we as a nation are made for higher things.
Pearse began as a cultural nationalist. His earliest public utterances are about the intellectual glories of the Gael, etc. His objective is to have Ireland contribute something distinctive to world civilization. That can only be in the cultural sphere because of the patent lack of power. Therefore, she must develop a distinctive culture. How would that be developed? Mainly through the language, which was the most distinctive dimension of Irish existence. A language under threat, disappearing, so he throws himself heart and soul into cultural revival.
Pearse joined the Gaelic League as soon as he had left school. His hard work and wholehearted commitment immediately made an impact. By his early 20s, he was editing the League newspaper on Clive Sullish. But Pearse was caught between two worlds, his fascination with Gaelic Ireland and a Victorian desire for respectability.
Within his own personality, there were these two tectonic plates. The Victorian is the respectable, the starchy, Pádraig Henry Pearse, B.A.B.L. And on the other hand, we have the Gael. We have Pádraig Mac Piarais, the man who aspired to this very romantic, very passionate, very pagan form of expression. And these two things were constantly in ferment within him, I think, throughout his adult life, certainly.
In Connemara, Pearse found his ideal of a truly Irish Ireland. He travelled widely on Gaelic League business, listening to the stories of local Irish speakers. In Rosmuck, Pearse built a cottage. It was a refuge from Dublin life and a place in which to create a new Irish literature.
One thing that has to be said about him is that his attachment to the Irish language was serious. The culture of the Cúpla Focal was already there. You identified Irish as our language and English as the foreign language, but you went on talking the foreign language. He didn't do that. He was serious. He went down to the Gaeltacht. He learned Irish. He wrote it extremely well.
Bhí na daoine fad baile helóch ag an afran. Bhí na gearmhad ag a rús a léimnach. Bhí na chalíní siosca cainte go mairach. Bhí na mná a chorá os ísio. Bhí na fearin a dust.
Pearse felt great empathy with the ordinary people of Connemara, but he knew that he remained to them a stranger, the young man in the fine suit.
You can almost see the line between Pearse and the local parish priest and the ordinary people of Connemara. And he wrote at one stage, you know, Pearse, you are too dark in yourself. When you come among them, you bring a dark cloud with you that lies heavily upon them. Is it your English blood that is the cause of that, I wonder?
The painful reality for Pearse was that the Ireland of his time was becoming more British and not less. Despite the best efforts of the League, the language itself was dying. Pearse saw education as both the cause of this anglicisation and the remedy.
But he actually describes the English education system in Ireland as a machine designed purposely to intimidate Irish people. And his condemnation of the system was based upon its absence of any catering for the national ideal. He wrote, actually, somewhat later, that the reform of the education system was as important as political independence.
In 1908, Pearse put his ideas into practice. He opened St. Enda's, Scoil Éine, an Irish-speaking school for boys, a blueprint for his educational revolution. Pearse was barely 28, but St. Enda's was built on the strength of his own personality.
Pearse himself, oh, he was absolutely outstanding. He had a magnetic quality, and he had a lovely voice, and he had, of course, absolute logic. He spoke, you could never, if you listened to him, you couldn't deny everything he said was what you should do and what your aim in life should be.
St. Enda's was imbued with Celtic mysticism. Myth and legend were a key part of Pearse's curriculum.
We used to talk to the boys practically every day. He went right through the story of Cuchulainn, the Cuchulainn saga, until we became part of it.
It was remarked that Cuchulainn was almost an invisible member of staff. There are a number of parallels between what Pearse was trying to do in St. Enda's and what was happening in the British public school system, even though he was critical of that very system. The first is a recognition of the importance of stories and legends and mythology. And so Pearse revives and reworks legends and myths from the Irish tradition as texts for boys. He saw that as a way in which he could educate a national Irish boy or citizen.
Pearse's school was an adventure. He went on a journey with these boys. They didn't know where they were going. That's what made it such a wonderful thing. That's why most of the pupils who experienced St. Enda's knew they were dealing with an exceptional man.
Of course, none of us realised that he was himself going to die on the very type of build-up in minds and training that he was trying to install in us.
At the foot of the Dublin Mountains, Pearse discovered the Hermitage. It was an imposing building set in 50 acres, and Pearse decided St. Enda's spiritual home. In 1910, Pearse moved his school, though he knew that the rent was well beyond his means. The Hermitage was to prove a crippling financial burden until Pearse's death.
Throughout his adult career, from the time he founded his school, he was building up debts that he couldn't repay. He didn't appreciate that he wouldn't be able to repay them because he was convinced that the Gaels would rally to him and they would provide the money to keep his crusade going.
At the Hermitage, Pearse's mood was changing. Robert Emmet had once walked the grounds, and Pearse claimed to feel his presence. In St. Enda's lessons, Celtic heroes began to be overshadowed by Ireland's political ghosts.
I have seen Irish boys and girls moved inexpressibly by the story of Emmet. I have always felt it legitimate to make use for educational purposes of an exaltation so produced.
First he told them the Cuchulainn saga, the Finn saga. By the time he reached the Hermitage, he was telling them the Tone and the Emmet saga, so to speak.
Pearse borrowed from his other childhood influences when talking to his boys about the glories of meeting an heroic end.
For Pearse, like for all people steeped in Victoriana, the great nightmare of life was growing old. The unacceptable thing was to grow old and die. Pearse idolised the great childhood writings of the late 19th century. He knew Peter Pan by heart, Again, he quoted approvingly, over again, that key phrase from Barry's Peter Pan, which was, "To die will be an awfully big adventure."
There are elements of truth built within the stereotypical image of Pearse. It is true, I believe, that, for example, during the prize-giving day at one of his schools, he gave a 12-year-old boy who was performing well in his studies a prize of a rifle and said, "You're going to need this." So he clearly was training a generation of people who might be described as zealots by their detractors, or as physical force revolutionaries or freedom fighters.
Never once did I ever hear him make a direct statement to his pupils about an insurrection. Except, I think it was about 1910, we were in an English class, just a small group of us. And to our surprise, suddenly Pearse opened up his mind and said, "You know," he said, "it will all end in an insurrection, the Irish struggle." He said, "There's no way out. It's the teaching of history."
The world outside St. Enda's was changing. Unionists battled against Home Rule. Ireland seemed on the brink of civil war. Pearse was profoundly affected by these political currents.
It's not really until the growing resistance of Ulster Unionists to the Home Rule Bill that his mind begins to take on a distinctly political cast. When the proposal for partition comes along, then Pearse begins to, in a sense, lose faith in the potential of the constitutional process and to say, well, if the only way you get results in this country is by threat of rebellion, then let us begin preparing for rebellion.
There was this kind of almost vertiginous descent towards war in the European context. With Ireland, we had the sudden eruption of the crisis caused by the failure of the Third Home Rule Bill, the setting up of the Ulster Volunteers, and by the end of the same year, the setting up of the Volunteers in Dublin.
A newspaper photo records the first meeting of the Irish Volunteers in 1913. The great and the good pose at the front. Unseen, at the back, stands Pádraig Pearse. 3 years later, those positions would be reversed. By 1913, St. Enda's was drowning in debt. The excitement of the school's first years had passed. Pearse needed a new outlet for his energies.
The Irish Volunteers offered him some excitement, uniforms, drilling, that kind of thing that he liked, seeing himself as at the head of a body of men. But at the same time, there was all this terror of St. Enda's going under, becoming bankrupt, and becoming a figure of ridicule and shame, rather than a heroic figure.
The Volunteers were a welcome diversion from Pearse's financial problems. Writing to the taxman, he proudly declared,
"I have no assets except a suit of clothes, a uniform, a rifle, and a sword."
St. Enda's debts were to change Pearse's career. The search for funds led him to a small group of conspirators who were secretly infiltrating the volunteer movement.
Well, then about October 1913, Pearse came to me and said that he was in very serious financial difficulties, and we were made bankrupt and the school was closed, and I thought this a pity. So I wrote to Joe McGarrity in America, and I managed with their help to fix up a little lecturing tour for him. He was very pleased when I swore him in as a member of the IRB before he went to America, and there's no doubt at all that that helped him.
I think it's probably true to say that when Pearse went to America, he was still a school teacher, and when he came back, he was a revolutionary.
In America, the IRB provided Pearse with a platform to make speeches and raise cash for his school.
What he was really about was putting together money through those performances to send back here to the school, desperately wiring money back here to keep the school going.
he finds himself with all these armchair generals of Irish America who want to hear about Ireland being about to rise and bloody the noses of the Brits. And that's what he rallied to. And the more extreme his speeches, the more enthusiastic the audience. They didn't want to hear about St. Enda's and bilingual education. They wanted to hear that a lot of British throats were going to be cut.
Pearse spent 3 months touring America. As he returned home in May 1914, he knew now where his future lay.
I believe the experience of being in America consolidated Pearse's sense of himself as a politically significant and effective radical nationalist.
He couldn't contemplate by the time he came back the notion that there wouldn't be a revolution. He had fed off Irish America. It had fed off him. And he had swayed some very large crowds. And he had promised Irish Americans that he would lead a revolution. And it became a matter of pride.
The Ireland Pearse returned to was consumed by thoughts of war. In the summer of 1914, Irish men in British uniform marched off to Belgium, fighting, they thought, for home rule. Their separatist colleagues remained at home, under pressure to prove themselves equal to the men at the front.
The idea that their generation were sacrificing themselves for an ideal in Europe. What were we doing about our ideal? What was happening in Flanders put it up to this tiny coterie of revolutionaries in Ireland. What do you stand for? What are you prepared to do for your ideals?
Pearse was rising quickly through the ranks of the open volunteer movement. But he was also anxious to make an impact at meetings of the small IRB circle, controlled by veteran fenian Tom Clark.
So Pearse got up. He was carried away by enthusiasm. So he said, when were they ever going to do anything? Well, those that were there had been doing quite a lot. There was one of them quite infuriated. Pearse said, give me 100 men and I'll free Ireland. I will attack the castle, which was a very extraordinary statement from anyone else. And this man got up and he made a violent attack on Pearse, very bitter, very rude. But Pearse was growling away beside me. He said, yeah. He said, I'm the only dangerous revolutionary of the lot of them.
Despite the tensions, both sides needed each other. Clark and the IRB had the organization. Pearse could provide the words for the revolution. In August 1915, the body of an old fenian, O'Donovan Rossa, was brought back to Dublin. His funeral was a chance for the rebels to stage a show of strength. Tom Clark asked Pearse to deliver the graveside oration.
Pearse was selected to do the O'Donovan Rossa speech. And my mother went out to the school and gave my father's message, make it as hot as hell.
Pearse had been nervous while drafting his speech, but as O'Donovan Rossa's coffin was lowered, the intense young headmaster stepped out of the political shadows and addressed the crowd.
Life springs from death, and from the graves of patriot men and women spring living nations. The fools, the fools, the fools! They have left us our fenian dead, and while Ireland holds these graves, Ireland unfree shall never be at peace.
The speech was a turning point for Pearse.
Certainly it took quite a while for Tom Clark, who was the spider at the centre of the IRB web, really, to trust Pearse, because he thought he was really just a rhetorician. But when Pearse gave the O'Donovan Rossa speech, Clark realised the quality of what they had. He realised they had the figurehead they needed. He could speak, he could write, he could provide the words to justify the revolution.
Pearse was ecstatic. He was accepted onto the military council of the IRB where he discovered that plans for an armed rising were well advanced. Writing to a contact in America, Pearse exclaimed, "The Rossa funeral was wonderful."
As you come closer to a rising and the military plans slip into place, then the propaganda dimension looms ever larger. How will this be, in a sense, marketed to the public? Once the decision for a rising has been taken, Pearse is very anxious to stamp his imprint on the image of the rising. So he embarks on this passionate series of pamphlets, in a sense, writing the gospel.
This period of his life, teaching during the day, perhaps rushing off to some volunteer meeting, perhaps spending a weekend down drilling in the country, back at midnight trying to write a newspaper article or balance these appalling books which were telling him all the time a story of ruin, imminent ruin. All that was churning round his head.
He never stopped. He was constantly on the go. But you could also say, in a psychological sense, that this helped to, if you like, deflect the turning inwards, the reflection upon the self, which was always difficult for Pearse, because who was this self, this Pearse?
In this period, Pearse attempted an autobiography which he left unfinished. He noted his parents' differing backgrounds, English and Irish, and wrote proudly that they had combined to make him an Irish rebel. But Pearse scored those words out and confided that his upbringing had made him the strange thing I am.
One could see the earnestness, the utter earnestness, the almost mystical earnestness of the man, the feeling that he was living in another world altogether. That he was already dedicated, that he knew he was going to die or something. You know, it's a very queer thought about Pearse. Supposing the others had all been executed after the rising, and supposing he had been spared. Could you imagine that? I think he would have gone mad.
Pearse was very clear about the sacrifice he was preparing to make. One of his last plays captured that mood.
One man can free a people as one man redeem the world. I will go into battle with bare hands. I will stand up before the goal as Christ hung naked before men on the tree.
For all your questions and requirements on building materials and
in the days leading up to Easter 1916, Pearse continued to play his multiple roles. He held now senior positions in the Volunteers and the secret Irish Republican Brotherhood, and he remained headmaster to the boys at St. Enda's. The rising loomed. In mid-April, Pearse gathered his pupils for the last time.
That was Pearse's farewell. He said, St. Enda's has been in existence for 8 years. It may go on to 80 years, but its work is done.
Pearse kept secret the fact that the rising was being planned, especially from his superiors in the Irish Volunteers. But there were signs that the Easter exercise he had organized was not to be routine.
Pearse, he started to talk on the manoeuvres that were going to take place on Sunday, and how important it was that every man would be out on them. And he was about to dismiss us when Con Colbert rose from the back of the hall and asked me to ask a question. And the question he asked was, Commandant, what about men who, if they come out on the manoeuvres on Sunday, are in danger of losing their jobs? And Pearse just looked in a very detached way down the room, and avoiding the eye of any questioner and looking at the right-hand wall, he just said, I don't think that any man should come out on Sunday's manoeuvres who is afraid of losing his job.
On Easter Monday, the rebels struck. Their plans for a countrywide rebellion had been spiked, but they pressed on in Dublin regardless.
You know, there was an air of unreality about 1916 as a military event. I mean, here you got all these characters dressing up in bespoke uniforms, going into the biggest building, the second city of empire, and saying to the biggest army in the world to come and get us.
Outside the G.P.O, Pearse proclaimed the Republic to a small group of bystanders. They were bemused, but he understood the significance of this moment.
He saw that the democratic will of the Irish people was never listened to. He believed then that a more aggressive line had to be taken. I think in its time that was the right decision.
The most striking thing about the Easter Rising was the absolute lack of any mandate at any level for it to take place. He brought about the death in this area of several hundred people, natives of Dublin, who were not consulted about whether or not they wished to die for Ireland, and throughout the following years, right to this year, people have been dying in the name of the cult that he helped to bring into existence.
The proclamation cannot be, I think, altered, thankfully. He gave his life, we're his heirs. He has given us the right to fulfill our destiny. Without violence, no person, no man can give a bigger sacrifice than that.
The Easter Rising left nearly 600 people dead. It had lasted barely a week.
The rising that occurred on Easter Monday was not the rising they had planned. Ironically, had the rising they planned occurred, Pearse might not at all have become so central a figure, because the military dimension would have continued much longer. The military authority of others would have been more important than his. It was precisely because it failed heroically and gallantly, but quickly, that then it's the image of the rising that becomes all important subsequently. And while Pearse is not the most important figure in planning the rising, he is the key to the image of the rising.
In his final days awaiting execution, Pearse greatly enhanced that image in a moving series of letters and poems.
We seem to have lost. We have not lost. To refuse to fight would have been to lose. To fight is to win.
The paradox of the martyr fantasy in Pearse was that he perceived it as the person who dies alone in public. You see this in his writing about Cuchulainn. I mean, Cuchulainn died alone. Christ died alone. And even in his court-martial, he begged that others would be saved and that he would die alone.
My dearest mother, I have been hoping up to now that it would be possible to see you again, but it does not seem. The beauty of the world hath made me sad, this beauty that will pass. Mother, goodbye. I have not words to tell my love of you, and how my heart yearns to you all. I will call to you in my heart at the last moment.
Early hours of the 3rd of May, they were taken down to where that cross now stands. Their hands were tied behind their backs. A white marker proclaimed...
The military authorities who ordered Pearse's execution could not have foreseen that within a few years it was they who would be gone, and he still remembered, nearly a century later.
Here we are treading hallowed ground because in this yard these men made the supreme sacrifice for a cause that was dear to their hearts, the freedom of their country.
I love Pearse for his poetry, for his writings, for his enthusiasm, for his determination. He had a vision.
As Pearse had predicted, the executions of the leaders had served to vindicate the rising itself, and it was Pearse who gained most in the aftermath.
we had a collection of martyrs, as it were, who were uncomfortable. Connolly couldn't be brought on board because he was a socialist, and socialism had no place in the free Ireland that developed. I didn't know enough about Tom Clarke, because on the whole, conspirators keep a low profile. But it was as if Pearse had created a whole body of literature just for this purpose. And he couldn't have done a better job, and it was a typically thorough Pearse job.
Perhaps Pearse had done too thorough a job at preserving his own memory. He is thought of today as the first president of the Republic. That is how Pearse described himself on a bulletin he wrote during Easter week. But many of the rebels thought that Tom Clarke had been given that honour.
I saw Tom Clarke, grey-haired old man he was. He stood very, very straight, very erect, quite fearless. And there were two young officers with him. I remember one introduced him to the other as the President of the Irish Republic. I didn't see Clarke anymore after that.
A year later, when the Easter week prisoners were released from prison, there was some surprise that the event was already being promoted as Pearse's Rising. Tom Clarke's wife was there with her son to meet Sean McGarry, the chairman of the Volunteers.
On the morning of the general releases, we were on the ramp in Westland Row Station when Sean McGarry, after saying hello to his family, rushed over to my mother and said, "Who in the hell made Pearse president?"
Because Pearse had a pen, he becomes increasingly the public image. And he slips from that into being not just a public image, but becoming the president. He assumes a status of office, which in fact does not reflect his previous position. He was never that dominant, but he assumes it as a right. And he was conscious of being in the succession of those he had written about over the previous few months: Tone, Emmett, Davis, Mitchell, Lawler. Pearse.
Pearse achieved the political immortality that he had sought. His family were paraded to confirm Pearse's blessing on his political heirs. But in many ways, independent Ireland fell short of Pearse's ideal.
The society which was created in the 1920s and 30s was not the sort of society that Pearse would have wanted. We didn't seek, for example, to change our education system or our legal system and inject into those systems Republican ideas and mores. We built an education system which frequently aped the education system of Britain. I think Pearse would have been unhappy with that.
Despite the official plaudits, Pearse's school did not survive the 1930s.
Two of the surviving staff who sent in have told me that they went in with Margaret Pearse to De Valera's, to government buildings, asking him for a grant to keep it going. And in the middle of the conversation, just as they were getting around to the discussion of money, his secretary came in and said, "He shikta to a $10 phone." And one of them said, and the school was closed a month later.
Pearse's social radicalism was forgotten. His image was reduced and simplified. He was a pious and selfless patriot, a soldier unconcerned with the practicalities of this world.
Pearse's work was full of religious imagery. People weren't going to mention that he'd been extremely anti-clerical anytime there was any kind of clash with the bishops. Pearse was very courageous in standing up to them. But he was a devout communicant. He didn't appear to have committed any sins. And he was a perfect role model for the kind of Ireland that developed after the Rising.
The image of Pearse as a plaster saint, as a stained glass window icon, that persisted into the 1960s. The classic example of it is that triptych in Galway Cathedral, where Pearse, John F. Kennedy, and Christ appear as the three persons of the Blessed Trinity, virtually, capturing, it seems to me, however strangely from today's perspective, a reverence for tradition in its purest form, as reflected in the image of Pearse.
Nobody bothered actually to learn anything about him. It was very convenient to have this person whom we were told would probably be canonized someday, who was a perfect son. They didn't really want to look at the reality behind a hero.
For those that cared to look, there was one side of Pearse which his supporters had always been at pains to conceal.
From the beginning, there was perhaps, if not an anxiety, certainly a concern about Pearse's bachelorhood.
The intense young headmaster had been teased for his shyness around women and had few close relationships outside his family. His biographers were keen to suggest that Pearse's lack of interest in women was the result of a broken heart.
Desmond Ryan, a friend of Pearse's, in his biography, actually constructs this secret love of Pearse's and uses this secret love to explain Pearse's isolation from adult emotional attachments. And the secret love he's talking about is a woman called Eileen Nichols. And Eileen Nichols was a Gaelic Leaguer. She was a colleague and a friend of Pearse's who drowned off the coast of Kerry. He was understandably upset at that, but that friendship subsequently became translated as having been a secret engagement.
The lost fiancé story was required for another reason. Pearse had never made a secret of his devotion to the boys in his care, but some of his writings made uncomfortable reading.
I forgive you, child, of the soft red mouth. I will not condemn anyone for a sin not understood. Raise your comely head till I kiss your mouth. If either of us is the better of that, I am the better of it. There is a fragrance in your kiss that I have not found yet in the kisses of women or in the honey of their bodies.
Pearse's fixation with the boy does have to be seen within the context of his time. And for late Victorian and early Edwardian culture, there is what is known really as the cult of the boy. This kind of fixation on youthfulness and youthful beauty. I would think that it's important to make a distinction between a knowing interest in young men and a more popular, a more popularized image of young men that was certainly common and circulated within Edwardian culture of that time.
He did have homosexual inclinations. He was not a practicing homosexual. I don't think he understood what homosexuality was about. You could even say that it was more than that. What he actually, the people he found attractive were young boys. But Pearse's behaviour was utterly proper at all times. He was a man of the highest ideals. That is the way he was. An interesting man, extraordinary man in many ways.
"50 years after the Rising, Pearse's reputation was unblemished.
I happened to have been 10 years old in 1966, and I remember it very vividly, when everything that the men of 1916 might have died for seemed to have been validated by this first tiny aperture of prosperity that modern Ireland had experienced. In 1966, and we may speculate if there had been a tribunal about some politician having been guilty of some venality or other, it would have been very plausible for people to have said, Pearse would be ashamed of you. But, I mean, if you were to utter that in the current context, it would be a virtually meaningless, and I would have thought for a lot of people almost a laughable phrase, because the nature of society has changed so much.
He was felt to be terribly important. He was felt to be a holy figure. Portraits were everywhere. The proclamation was everywhere. A holy image, but a blurred one. That had any connection with political violence was swept under the rug. He had sacrificed his own life. That's what he did. That he had caused other people to be killed was ignored.
Just a few years later, Pearse's image was thrown back into sharp focus. In the south, his poems were read by school children. In the north, Pearse retained his original potency.
Pearse was extremely important in the early days of the Republican struggle. I mean, whenever I was in Longcash internment camp, it was Pearse's poetry that people were painting on hankies to smuggle out of the jail. It was Pearse's pamphlets that were about the place. Pearse hadn't gone away for us in the late 60s, early 70s.
Pearse's opponents dug out his most lurid writings to make explicit the link with modern IRA violence.
We may make mistakes in the beginning and shoot the wrong people, but bloodshed is a cleansing and sanctifying thing, and the nation which regards it as the final horror has lost its manhood.
Pearse, he himself had said, Ireland unfree shall never be at peace. And by unfree he meant if the British were ruling any part of Ireland, it wasn't free. Those are foundation documents of the IRA.
It was the blood sacrifice. It was a situation where there was war, and people had to adopt a very fundamentalist position, and it was Pearse who spoke to that fundamentalism.
Once the Provosts, in a sense, invoked Pearse as their spiritual father, their idea was this, of course, would spread the benign image of Pearse onto their own activities and justify them, indeed glorify them. But the critics of the Provosts began to say, well, if Pearse is their spiritual inspiration, and this is what these guys are doing, then there must have been something wrong with him.
The Troubles pushed Pearse into a political wilderness. He suffered guilt by association. In the late 70s, plans to erect a statue to Pearse were quietly dropped.
The fall from grace of Pearse's image since 1966 has to do with the whole presentation of the image of Pearse, with this creation of this quasi-fascistic individual, obsessive in character, hell-bent on sacrificing his own blood in the manner of Christ. If you present a very simplistic picture of Pearse, obviously you're going to get that deterioration of an image.
On Westland Row, the school that Pearse and his brother Willie attended, where he first learned Irish, and where he is now almost forgotten.
I was a pupil here myself in the 60s, and of course the whole Pearse thing was very, very important. And from that period, and maybe even before that, we used every Easter have a special school parade to Arbor Hill, which was kept up for a number of years. Now that just went by the wayside. The history curriculum is a bit more specialised now as far as periods are concerned. So it is possible to go through, certainly secondary school, without learning perhaps anything of the Pearse brothers. You know, that would be possible, all right. And I think a lot do, you know.
Writer, poet, journalist and teacher. He even set up his own school, St. Enda's, which was set
The traditional Pearse can be found still in a few places, but of the Ireland that he hoped to build, there are fewer signs. Irish remains the spoken language of a small minority. Faith in the spiritual virtues of the Gael belongs now to a different century.
I'm more in sorrow than in anger. Where is the reality that came from that dreaming that they died for? It's a bad thing that he's just, after all he did, his stature as an Irishman, as an educationalist, apart from everything else, he does not deserve to be just brushed aside or neglected. And to be ignored is nearly worse than being attacked.
A rehearsal of a new play at the Abbey Theatre by Danny Morrison. It is Pearse's journey in reverse, from political to cultural struggle. Republicans once looked to Pearse for inspiration. Now they question his relevance.
Tell us this. Have you never had any doubts about the G.P.O. and old Pearse? And there's a man couldn't shoot straight.
I think the older you get, of course, you look at things quite differently. You have to fight a war from a fundamentalist position, but you cannot fight a peace process from that position. We view Pearse through that prism, through that change. I think that to read Pearse now might seem like an anachronism.
Pearse's politics are fading from view. But the Gaelic cultural movement which first attracted him continues to thrive. Even if he no longer has the power to inspire or repel, Pearse will still have a presence in places like this.
I think that there has been a jump of a generation. I mean, the founders of this club, let's say, in 1962, they would have had a tangible link with the era, with the 1916 era. The current generation of youngsters, let's say, are sort of a generation removed, so it's less tangible. I think that Pearse will find his place. I think it's a sort of maybe a temporary lull in enthusiasm for him. But like he did state, "O wise men, riddle me this, what if the dream come true?" And the dream has come true in a lot of ways.
Well, you know, I always believe that if you live long enough, you'll see it all again. And I'd hope by the time when we get to the centenary of 1916, that the generation will have gone full circle. And I think people will see Pearse and the people who worked with him, the people who did their best with him, have played an extraordinary part in Irish history. And they still motivate people. They still motivate people like me.
He was a kind of genius, to my mind, a warped one, but a real one. He certainly was, I think, the outstanding figure of Irish nationalism in the 20th century, unfortunately for us.
I think it would be a great pity if Pearse were to be forgotten through, in a sense, denial or through deliberate amnesia, because having been appropriated by the provosts, then in reaction against that, we want to simply blot out from Irish history anything which appears to give comfort to that particular perspective. Pearse was a very significant historical figure, not in perhaps the way that his idolaters or his demonizers saw, but he was a significant historical figure. We simply distort our history if we try to write him out of it.